Tonight, as the sun sets over the course of the next hour and a half, 2 hours or so, the realities of the Shoah weigh heavily on our hearts. Yom HaShoah begins tonight and continues into tomorrow through the day. It's a time for reflecting on the horrors. It's a time for remembering the evil. It's a time for saying loudly and passionately that we will never forget. I think often about the sacrifices that we're willing to make for our Judaism. And if you're just coming in, come and settle in. And think what you're willing to give up to preserve that Jewishness that you carry within you. What are you willing to give up? We don't think about it so much as modern Jews living in a free and relatively easy society. But our ancestors had to ask that question time and time again throughout history. They had to decide what was more important, preserving Judaism, preserving a Torah, or their very lives. And in the Shoah, and many moments throughout Jewish history, Jews chose to safeguard, to preserve our heritage, our traditions, our values at the risk of death. It's hard to imagine, but they did. And so there were tiny fragments of pieces of the Talmud that were brought into camps so that in secret, Jews who were there in death camps could learn just the same line from the Talmud every morning, just to have some connection, some spark of connection to who they were, even though we know if they were found out, it would mean their end. Torahs were buried, Torahs were hidden. Our ancestors did everything they could in the worst and most unimaginable situations to be able to say, Ani Yehudi, I'm Jewish and I'm proud, and I don't care what the world out there says about it. We're very blessed here at TBT that in our ark we safeguard 2 Shoah Torah scrolls. Every time we open the ark, I look at them. Every time I see them, I give them a kiss. And it gives me chills to think about what our ancestors sacrificed. It gives me chills to think of how proud I am of our people, how far we've come and how far we have yet to go despite the evils of our world. And so as we think of all that tonight, we're really blessed to have Harry Rappaport with us as our featured presenter. He's going to tell the story of these 2 scrolls that we use on a regular basis, that we see housed in our ark all the time. And then we'll turn after the presentation to a memorial service so that we can remember the lives of 6 million innocent men, women, and children, and so many others whose lives were cut short, whose lives were stolen. Harry.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yom HaShoah. Many people honor those who died in the Holocaust on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. That was a day that was set aside by the United Nations. It's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. However, those of us within the Jewish community celebrate Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 27th day of Nisan on the Hebrew calendar, which falls on April 17th this year. This day is recognized because it is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in which 50,000 Jews were killed for their heroic defiance against the Nazi regime. While this number seems like a lot, and it is just a drop in the bucket of the millions who died in what we Jews call the Holocaust. Because of the mass elimination of Jews, as of today, only 4.7 million Jews have been identified. Essentially, 1.3 million Jews have still not been named. Being a child of Holocaust survivors, this breaks my heart. I'll be speaking to you, turn it on. I'll be speaking to you about 8 Holocaust survivors. On the top is my mother and father, top left. On the bottom is Penny's parents. Right up here is Jack Abramowitz's parents. And down here is Donna Abramowitz's parents. I'll introduce them to you in a moment. 8 Holocaust survivors. They come from Poland. My mom comes from Lodz, Poland. And all the others, the other 7, come from Częstochowa, Poland. The families in Częstochowa knew each other before the war. Their parents knew each other before the war. And we are friends with Donna and Jack Abramowitz, as my parents were friends with these other people. And our children and our grandchildren, who are great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, are friends as well. And I'd like for the Abramowitzes and the Rappaports to stand. If you could all stand. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Thank you. Penny's parents, Hanka, her mother, Anna here in the States, was only 12 years old when the war started. The child, the oldest of 5 girls. Penny's dad lived down the block from Penny's mother. He was 19 when the war started. My mother and father. My mother, Rushka, was just 18, and she was engaged to be married, and her fiancé died very early on in the war. My dad, Morris Moshe, was 31 when the Holocaust started. He was married. He had a wife. He had a child. And at some point during the war, his wife was pregnant as well. Donna's parents, Tamara and Shima Jesinovich. 21 and 26, they survived the Częstochowa ghetto, the town where the Torahs come from. My father was from Częstochowa, the town where the Torahs come from. My mom was the only one that was from Lodz, Poland. Jack's parents. Jack's father was 29 when the war started. He was married and had a child very early on during the war. And Jack's mother, Altala, was married and had no children at the time. Częstochowa, Poland. It was called the Bloody Monday. That's the day when the Nazis came into Częstochowa, Poland. My grandfather, Eliezer Hirsch Rappaport, was the first one killed by the advancing Nazi troops. The Holocaust is not fiction. It happened. It happened in September 1939 to May 1945. I'm a child of the Holocaust survivors, born in a DP camp, as Jack is. Penny was also born in Germany after the war. Donna was born in Poland. Her parents remained in Poland until her mom died in the early 60s when she came to the States with her father and her brother. Penny went to Israel with her parents right after the war in 1947. Her father was immediately drafted into the fledgling, about to be the State of Israel, Israeli Defense Forces. I will shortly take you into how the Torahs were rescued. But the Torahs were rescued because they were Holocaust Torahs, and I can't get into the story without speaking about my background, my parents' background, our parents' background in the Holocaust. It's not fiction, it happened. I'm about to take you on a trip, and not a very pleasant trip, that started 80-something years ago, where people were tortured and slaughtered, and not many survived, except our parents are a few of the survivors of the Holocaust. September 4th, 1939, my grandfather was the first one that was killed. This is all archived pictures of Częstochowa, Poland. German soldiers lined the Jews up for execution. A group of Jews apprehended. It was the beginning of the war. My father took his father's body, the first one killed in town, and took him to the Jewish cemetery. The rabbi didn't want to go. There was a curfew out, and he forced him to go with him to the cemetery because he wanted to bury his father and give him a Kiddush Hashem burial. The beginning of the war, he was still able to erect the mitzvah, to be able to erect the monument for the grave. Like most big towns in Poland, 1/3 of the population were Jews. In Warsaw also, they had about 665,000. Warsaw had a lot more, but also 1/3 were Jewish people. The Yellow Star, immediately, when the Nazis came into whatever town in Europe they came into, Jews had to wear this yellow demeaning star. It meant to publicly identify them, to humiliate the Jews. People were not be able to work for the government anymore. Doctors couldn't have couldn't have non-Jewish patients. Shops were closed and looted. It started with Kristallnacht in Germany, and it continued throughout Europe. Immediately, within a year, less than a year in some places, Jews were forced from their home, and they were forced into the ghetto. Non-Jews had to move out of the ghetto and probably take the homes of the Jews, and Jews had to be forced into a cramped ghetto, a ghetto without sanitation, a ghetto with rationed food, not enough food to go around, constantly being driven from their homes and forced into the ghettos. Whatever they had to be able to trade and barter for food was done. They needed sustenance. They needed medicine while it was able to be gotten, while it was available. They were resettled into their ghettos. You can see how they're forced to take whatever few possessions they were allowed to take and brought into the ghettos of Europe. Forced to be starved, forced to be sick. Here's a picture of my mother-in-law with a circle. Like I said, she was the oldest of 5. The youngest one isn't in this picture. My mother-in-law and her 10-year-old sister, she was 12, she was 10, were forced into labor like most people because you had to provide and help the German forces, their war effort. You had to do something, because if you didn't, you were useless to the Germans. She worked in a factory, and I ran across this rendering of exactly what my mother-in-law did. They need small people, small kids, usually girls with small fingers, because they were needed to load the bullets, and that's exactly what's being done here. And this is where she worked, 12, 18 hours a day. And she was lucky, because if you worked, you received some extra rations at work. You received an extra piece of bread and maybe some soup that had a little something in it, watered down soup. And you know how brave these girls were? Because my mother-in-law and her sister, 2 years younger, if they got an extra piece of bread during the day, they would take a bite and put it in their pocket and bring it home, because there were 3 other children that were too young to work. And I'll come across a picture later of the grave. One day, in the middle of the war, my mother-in-law and her sister came home, and there was no mom there, and there were no 3 little sisters there, because they were worthless. They consumed rations, and they were taken to a pit with all the other young mothers and all the other children, and they were shot and buried in this mass grave. Children of the ghetto. How terrible it was for the children of the ghetto. Many of them were orphans. They would die in the street. They would beg for food. And who could help them? People couldn't even help themselves. Children forced to wear the stars. Children suffering. In September of 1942, in the Lodz ghetto, there was a decree that 20,000 children were to be deported to the Chelmo gas chambers, to the Chelmo, no gas chambers, Chelmo concentration camp. There were no gas chambers in operation yet. They took these kids and they put them in vans. And children stood by and watched other children being put in vans and gassed in vans. Small amounts at a time, maybe 20, 30 at a time. Children had to watch other children being gassed. Maybe they were standing there with a sibling. There were no adults. There were no parents to hold their hand. Children being robbed of everything that a child deserves. There was no education. There was no future. There was no love. There was death. death. Children from Lodz being taken and deported to the Chelmo camp for gassing. These are the gas vans. These are the vans. These are the trucks that they use to force these children in that were taken away from their parents, these useless children. And a mom saying goodbye to her child, practically ripped from the mother's breast. 1.5 million children. Can you imagine that number? 1.5 million children. Children dying, children being killed. There weren't too many children that survived the Holocaust. No old people survived the Holocaust. They were useless. If you were lucky, you weren't gassed, because when you got to the concentration camp, there were medical officers set up, and there were lines. And if you looked strong enough to help the Germans in the camps that had work, you went to the right. And if you weren't, and if you were too young or too old or too handicapped, you went to the left. And left meant death. En route to the Umschlagplatz, the gathering place, when they took the Jews from the ghettos, they took them to the gathering place, the Umschlagplatz. And there they were gathered, and there they were loaded onto trains. And if it wasn't at the train tracks, they were loaded onto trucks, and the trucks brought them to the trains. Jewish people. Here, see them here walking to the Umschlagplatz. When they got to the concentration camps, and I will get to the cattle cars in a minute, but when they got there, they were immediately separated, men from women. It was more orderly that way, to keep the men separate and to keep the women and the children separate. Arriving off the trains to the concentration camps. In September of 1942, my dad was taken to the Treblinka death camp. Treblinka was not a concentration camp. Treblinka was a death camp. In Treblinka, 1.91 million people were killed. 1.90. I'll have the number in a minute. It was September of 1942 to October 8th, the day after Yom Kippur, till October 8th. There was 39,000 Jews were taken from Częstochowa, one town in Poland. In that short span, 39,000. My father was in that transport on October 2nd, 1942. My father said when he got out of the cattle car, and when the doors opened up, it was night, there were spotlights, there were Nazis, there were Ukrainian guards, there were dogs, there were machine guns, there were bayonets, and there was chaos. And when the doors opened up, you see, when they first went into the car, they forced as many people into these cattle cars as they could. And the last second, before the doors closed, they said, everyone, raise your hands up, everyone. And the reason for that is they can put another 30, 40 people into these cattle cars. And when they got to their destination, sometimes a day later, sometimes 2 days later, there was no food, there was no sanitation, there were no bathrooms. And when the doors opened up, this was what was left in the cattle car. People that didn't make it, even to the concentration camp, even to the death center. People that couldn't make it. On October 2nd, 1942 is when he got there. This is a picture of his daughter, and I'll speak about that picture later. See, his wife was 7 months pregnant, and she couldn't disembark, get out of that train fast enough. And Kurt Franz, and we just saw his picture, they called him Lalka because he was a very pretty man. He was a very handsome guy. And they called him Lalka, which is Polish for doll. And as handsome as he was is how vicious he was. And he took his bayonet, like he did oftentimes when he saw pregnant women, and he stabbed her with the bayonet and shot her dead. And my dad's daughter, my half-sister, was crying for her father, and that's the last time he saw her. A sister that I never knew, but whom I learned to love. Here they are naked, going into the gas chambers. See, my father too was naked. It was not a work camp. Treblinka was not a work camp. Everyone was sent there to be gassed. Everyone. There were about 100 people working. They called them Sonderkommando. They were working. They were orderlies. They were people who sorted the clothes. There were people who took the bodies out of the gas chambers and put them into the ovens. And whatever slave labor they could possibly think of. And my dad was naked in line on his way to the gas chamber, and there was a person there working, sorting clothes, who was a friend of my father's from a previous transport. And he threw him a pair of pants. He said, "Moshe, quick, put these on and start sorting clothes with me." And that's how he survived the gas chambers of Treblinka. Sonderkommando, like I said, are people who do all the dirty work. Only 67 people are known to have survived Treblinka out of, I'm sorry with the wrong number before, 925,000. 1.1 were killed in Auschwitz. This is second only to Auschwitz, 925,000. And part of his job, like I said, was to take the bodies of the people and put them into the crematoriums, and you'll see that later. Shoes that were left in Auschwitz, hairbrushes that were left in Auschwitz. When it was liberated, this was found. Some of it was Majdanek, some of it was Auschwitz. Majdanek was pretty much intact when it was liberated. Crutches, orthopedic devices. See, they took the rings off of people, the jewelry off of people, and the gold was melted down, along with gold teeth, melted down and sent back into Germany. And some of us know the story of how they got to Switzerland and all these things that were stamped with the Nazi symbol, these bars of gold that they were melted to. See, when he was working, sorting clothes, a lot of people left some food in their clothes, in the lining of clothes, jewelry, watches, precious stones. And when they could, the inmates working there, when they could, they would take some and put it to the side. If you were caught, you were immediately killed, tortured first, or killed, or sent in with the others coming in all day long, day and night, being sent to the gas chambers of Treblinka. And he managed to escape. 3 months later, my dad formed an escape party of 9, 3 groups of 3, and with their precious stones that they were managed to hide, and they had to put away civilian clothes, and they even were able to use some of these stones to buy a map, to bribe a guard for a map of Treblinka and the environs of Treblinka, and a revolver and cyanide pills. Because if you were caught, what they did to people who escaped in Treblinka, you were hanged by your feet until you were dead. However long that took. And left there hanging for everyone to see. This is what happens to people who try to escape. And that's why they had the cyanide pills. Hard labor. The people who were fit to work and received the measly rations that they did receive and barely survived on the sustenance that they had were forced to work as slave laborers day and night, all through the day. The punishment was horrific. Everyone got beat. Everyone got whipped. Everyone got kicked. Everyone. The brutality. After the gassing, they were put into the crematorium. Terrible, terrible picture. But it needs to be seen. This is what was done to our people. And from there, they were taken right into the crematoriums, and on the other side of the oven it was opened up where the ashes came out, or underneath there was a pail that came out. I think you can see, yeah, there it is, the pail underneath. And every single person that was gassed was cremated in this fashion. Every single person. Auschwitz. See, my mother from Lodz, the family stayed intact. Not all families stayed intact, like complete. But it was just her and her mother and father and a kid brother. And one day, I think it was August 7th, 1944, my grandfather, my mom's dad, came back from his work detail, and he received a note that one of the family has to report for tomorrow's quota. One in the family. My mom was already in her early 20s at the time, 21 I think, 22 perhaps, and she wrote a note in the middle of the night, said, "Dad, you're the head of the family, pater familias, you are needed. There's mom and there's brother, Yosef. They need you, they don't need me." And she snuck out. And when her dad found the note, he ran after her. She was already at the Umschlagplatz, the gathering point. She was on a truck, on the bed of a truck, being taken out. And the last time she saw her father, he was yelling, "Rushka, Rosa, what have you done to our family?" And she was sent to Auschwitz. And somehow she survived. And the family did not. And she lived with guilt of survival every single day of her life. Every day of her life. And I'm telling you these stories because a lot of Holocaust survivors kept everything inside. They couldn't even bear to think about it or talk about it. My parents were different. My parents were very vociferous, especially my dad. And I heard all these stories all my life. I was 2.5 when we came to the States. And this is what they spoke about. They were friends mostly with other Holocaust survivors. When they got together, they always asked, "Where were you during the war? Where were you liberated? Where are you living?" This was constantly the subject. I remember one time when I must have been about 7 years old, I was sitting in the room or in the next room, and there were some new people there, and my mother was talking to this lady. And, "Where were you? Where was your family?" And during their conversation, they came to realize that this lady's brother died in my mother's arms. Immediately, separation of men and women. Auschwitz concentration camp where 1.1 million were killed. It means 200,000 were alive of Auschwitz. See, when the Russians came, and the Soviets, they were on our side, at the end of the war. So they were coming from the east, and the Americans were coming from the south, and the British and the Canadians were coming, I believe, from the north. And finally, in the end of May, there was a complete surrender by the Germans, but Auschwitz was liberated early on in January 27th, 1945. The Częstochowa ghetto, and I'll get back to that in a minute, was liberated on January 17th, 1945. My father would tell me, and the reason I'm telling the stories, it's all our stories. It's all our stories. But like I said, my parents were vociferous. Some of the others don't have all these details that I'm aware of. So I speak frequently to schools. I spoke to a school this morning in Valley Stream, and I know these stories, and I tell these stories, and it's my PowerPoint. I try to add more because we're talking about the Torahs, and we will get to the Torahs, but the Torahs is part of all of us here, all of us sitting here, and also in the back I see Howie and his family sitting back there, and that's also part of the Abramowitzes, Howie and Rachel and Brody. Back to concentration camps. This is what they looked like when they arrived, the poor people when they arrived. My dad, when he was on work detail in Treblinka, and people would ask, "What's happening? Where are we going?" And he said, "Look up at the smoke. That's where your wife is. That's where you will be. Look at the smoke." Terrible, terrible concentration camps. Children, electrified barbed wire. See, it was so tough. I mean, we know that if you don't eat a lot at night, you wake up, "Oh, I'm so hungry." That's not the hunger they had. They had hunger because they didn't eat yesterday. And they were hungry the week before. And they were hungry last month. And they're going to be hungry next week. And they tried to live from day to day with whatever they could. And people were dying all over the place. And they knew eventually they'd be liberated because God, how can this go on forever? You know, when my dad escaped Treblinka, I heard him say one time, he didn't think there'd be a Jewish race left. He thought this was it. The inmates working the details, women getting to Auschwitz and their heads immediately shaved. Most of them were killed. Some of them were selected for work. They had to line up every day, 5 in a row, because it was easy to count, 5, 10, 15. Counting was important. And when someone wasn't there, they would count again and again, and you'd be in on that line, God knows how long. God knows how long. Lined up, 5 in a row. 5 in a row. Here's a woman. She probably looks like she's 80 years old. Believe me, this is a younger woman. You can see the background, all the people that share the blanket, if you had a blanket. You know, I'm going to go for a minute now to the liberation of Chainz Chava. January 17th, 1945, when Chainz Chava was liberated. The day before, or the weeks before even, you heard the Russian front. You heard rumors that the Russians were coming. It was closer to the Russian border. And you were hoping you'd be liberated soon, but then for some reason they were camped on the other side of the river before Chainz Chava for weeks and weeks. And all of a sudden, you heard some noise. And whoever was able to hide out on January 16th, the day before this, was liberated on the 17th. But whoever wasn't, Jack's father, my father, were taken on a death march. A death march till they got to a place where there was either a railroad track behind German lines or a truck to take them to a railroad track, and then they were taken into Germany, again to concentration camp, again, after all they went through. Mass graves, when they were liberated, these were Russians, I believe, whatever bodies they found, they couldn't leave them there, they had to put them into mass graves, thousands and thousands that weren't burned yet or buried yet. I told you before about the Penny's mother, my mother-in-law, when she came home and there was no sisters left and the mother was gone. This is a monument marking that mass grave in Poland. We've been there many times. We visited it. This is what the barracks looked like. This is what they were like when they were liberated, if they were liberated. This is how skinny they were. My father was 60 pounds when he was liberated. Liberation. How great it was to be liberated. Look how happy these people are, cheering the army that liberated them. Dachau liberated by the U.S. 7th Army. Cheering, happy. But after the Germans mercilessly stripped the Jewish prisoners of their dignity, the liberators were the first to restore their humanity. But for many survivors, the liberation was the saddest moment of their lives because that's when they realized they had no one. They were all alone. There was no family. Nobody. U.S. troops, April 30 of 1945, seeing what was left behind. You know, Bergen-Belsen is where my parents met. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp at liberation became the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. Not where I was born, but that's where they first met. And if you see here, and I'll talk about that in a moment, 10,000 unburned dead were found here, and 13,000 died after the liberation. And I'll talk about it. This is what the people liberated looked like. This is what starving, almost dead people looked like. Receiving food, rations from the soldiers. You see, their bodies, their stomachs were so distended, and when they got rations, when they got some food, many of them died. Their bodies couldn't handle all that nourishment. They were used to eating nothing. How lucky they were if they were in line for their bowl of soup. The people in the front maybe got a little piece of meat or a little piece of potato skin. And the people at the end got watered down soup or nothing at all. Nothing. The rations that they're consuming, many of them died from that nutrition that they received. American medics helping some injured people, so close to death, But there was a renewal of life. You had nobody, no one. People hooked up and got married and had children. My mother-in-law was just 17. She got married. Her younger sister that survived with her was 15. 15 years old when she got married. My father met my mother. His wife was gone. His child was gone. The pregnant wife was gone. Renewal of life in the camps. That's my mother and father at the front of the bicycle. At a Holocaust memorial in the DP camp, my mother and father in the center of the, holding on to the ribbon. Renewal of life. See, they were married in March of 1945. They were liberated on January 17th, and they got together and they were married. Shortly after the complete surrender of the Germans, they went to Germany right away, and they tried to get out like all the other displaced persons. Here it is. The Jewish refugees in Germany are protesting the British embargo. They weren't letting any of the Jews go to Palestine. Who wanted them? Nobody wanted the Jews. Nobody. See, my mom didn't know yet that her parents were dead. And she was already with my dad and said, we got to go back to Poland. I got to find my parents. Where else can they be? But we'll go back to our home where we left. And in the DP camp every day or every time there was a new list of people, survivors who registered with the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, they would line up and they would go through the lists to see if they had someone. How happy my mom was when she found a second cousin, her closest surviving relative, a second cousin. From big families. She had 7 uncles and aunts on one side, 6 on the other side. The family was immense. She found a second cousin. So they went back to Poland. At that time, they went from Germany, and they crossed the border. They hopped on a freight train, again, but like hobos, and they went back into Germany. They went into Lodz. They went to Poland, went into Lodz, and she went to the home, her home. And she knocked on the door, and the Polish people living there wouldn't let them in. They wouldn't let the Jewish people in. You're coming back to take your house? It's not my house. I've been living here for a few years. And in the courtyard, she looked through the window, and she saw the drapes that her mother sewed with her own hands. And she saw some of the furniture, her mother and father's furniture. And they stayed on a park bench for 3 days in Lodz. They had no place to go. They were homeless. They were survivors, but they were homeless. Who helped them? Nobody. Nobody. My father went back to the cemetery to look for his father's grave, and he couldn't find it. And when he buried him 4 or 5 years earlier, you know, it was a custom, you wash your hands at the cemetery when you leave the cemetery. There's a water well in the cemetery. And he counted 25 paces, and there he buried his father 25 paces away from the well. And he went back there after the war to pay his respects to his father's grave that he buried with his own hands. And he found the grave, but there was no stone. The stone was gone. The stone he had commissioned at the beginning of the war. And some other survivors in town told him that the Poles, the Polish people, took a lot of the good marble and they're using them throughout town for sidewalks. And it took him 2 weeks, and he searched, and he found the stone broken up, and he reclaimed it, and he had it put into a bigger monument because he had no grave for his mother and his pregnant wife and his aesthetica. And there he commemorated and memorialized them. And this is what it looked like. That original stone, Rappaport, and this other stone. Honik bar ish yashor harag al kiddush Hashem. Here is buried a gentleman, a straight man, killed and sanctified for God, al kiddush Hashem. On July 4th, 1946, there was a pogrom in Kielce, Poland, and 42 people were killed. This is a sanctioned government killing of survivors who came back to Poland after the war. And my father's best friend was one of the 42 that were killed. The next day, they said they're not staying in that country anymore. Poland was anti-Semitic then. It was anti-Semitic now, perhaps. And we see it here, it's worse there. Believe me, it's worse there. So they decided they're now going to leave and go back to Germany and re-register at the displaced persons camp because they got to go. And they had other friends, survivors, who were in the DP camps. And they went to cross the border, but the borders that now were closed. And they got caught sneaking over the border to Germany. And they were arrested and they were jailed. And they spent 30 days in jail each. The day they got out of jail, they were told while in jail that you could get into the Czech Republic, which is Czech Republic was then Czechoslovakia. You could get into Czechoslovakia easy, and from there you can sneak across the border back into Poland, and it's not as difficult as trying to get directly into Germany, and that's what they did. Again, hopping on freight trains. And they got to the DP camps, and here we got the waiting game. Who will take us? Where can we go? Quotas here, quotas there. It's 1947, 2 years after the war. I was already born. I was a year old at the time. Born in Bad Reichenhall, DP camp. Note the birth rate in the camps, in the American zone alone, 750 babies were born each month. People needed families. They had nobody. No one. They needed their families. Children were born in displaced persons camp. The picture by my slide 103, that's my mother and father and myself. Families needed to be started. Picture of Penny and her mother and father. Picture of me with that funny little hat on. With my mom. You know, during the holidays we send out cards. Christmas cards, New Year's cards, Hanukkah cards, season's greetings cards, to let people know, we're thinking about you, we're here, write a little story in the back of what life's been like for the last year. Who did they have? 1947, 1948. I mean, they had some Holocaust survivor friends that they knew, maybe now living in Munich or maybe living in Berlin, they're in Stuttgart, whatever it is, Bamberg. They needed to let people know that we're here. They made some new friends. There were some people. She had a second cousin. May 18th, 1949, I was 2.5, the day we came to the United States. That's when my father said he felt like he was born again. Here we were in a free country. We could practice our religion. I mean, a lot of anti-Semitism going on now, and it's very unfortunate, and it's terrible. But the world we knew growing up, all of us, we didn't know from any anti-Semitism. When I was a kid in school, and when I was in high school and college, when I was in the service, well, the service maybe I knew a little bit, but we didn't know really of any anti-Semitism. My father called it his birthday. I remember when they were studying to become citizens. You got little brochures. You had to know who your congressman was, the mayor was, senator, other facts about the Constitution. They were greener. They were immigrants. They didn't know English that well. They just came to the United States a few years ago. My father was 36 at the time. I remember as a child how difficult it was for children of Holocaust survivors. I remember sitting there with the pamphlet, reading the pamphlet, and teaching them and prompting them and helping them learn the facts. And they became a citizen. How proud they were to be a citizen. And I became a citizen derivatively through them. And how happy, I mean, I shouldn't say happy because it was during Vietnam, but how proud they were that I was in the service, serving the country that gave them the privilege and the freedom. See, in 1963-64, Kurt Franz, the then deputy commander of the concentration camp, was caught in Germany. He was arrested. He and other Treblinka guards and hierarchy were on trial in Dusseldorf, Germany. And my father was asked to come and testify because he saw and knew what Kurt Franz did to his wife And in the piles of clothes on a daily basis, the German guards, headed by Kurt Franz, would take their bayonets because women would hide their babies in the piles of clothes and they would keep on poking around. And if they found a baby, they would hold it up for everyone, all the guards, to cheer. And he went to testify, and he was asked by the prosecutor, can you stand up and point to the person who bayoneted your wife and who you saw commit all these genocidal murders? And he stood up, and he pointed, and he had an emotional breakdown. They thought he had a heart attack. And they took him to the hospital, and he recovered, and a few days later he came back, and he finished his testimony, and Kurt Franz and others were convicted. And he was sentenced to life in prison, but was released after 28 years and died a free man. A free man. And on that trip to Germany, he went back and found his father's grave. He went to Poland. There was a short trip from Germany to Poland, and he found his father's grave and gave the proper respects. See, when he came to the United States, he knew that his then wife had a brother in the United States that came in the 30s, and his name was Grimkowski. And he searched and searched wherever he could, in periodicals, in newspapers, in weeklies. He would put a note, does anybody know this name, Grimkowski? He's my brother-in-law. He may have a picture of my daughter. When he testified, you saw the news article that appeared on the Associated Press throughout, and the article somehow reached Grimkowski, and he got a call shortly after he came back from Germany and Poland on that visit, and he got a call, and he said, I'm Grimkowski. My name is now Grauman. It was changed, and I'm your brother-in-law. The next day, and he lived in the Bronx, we lived in Jersey. The very next day, I took my father and my mother to Grauman, and he saw the picture, he was given the picture, the photograph, and again, one of the most emotional moments of my life. I saw my dad fall upon that picture. And he had that picture, and he made copies of it, and it was in every single room of the house. And he kept a copy in his wallet. Here he is a few years later, because he knew the date of their death, because they left Częstochowa, Poland on Hoshana Rabbah and arrived on Shmini Atzeret, and he lit the candle, his yurtzeit candle, for his Estetika. See, fast forward to 1980. 1980, my dad had cancer, and knew he was terminal, and he took Penny and myself to Poland because he wanted us to see the grave. That meant so much to him. And we went there, and it was in the summer, it was August, and we found the cemetery, a cemetery that didn't have any Jewish people there at all anymore to take care of it, a cemetery full of weeds and trees and underbrush. And Penny and I and my dad, we searched and we searched and we searched, and we could not find the grave. The despair was so great you could cut it with a knife, because that's what the cemetery looked like after 40 years of neglect at that time. Trees grew where they weren't before, a forest. How could you find a grave? He looked for the well. He couldn't find the well. And on the way out of the cemetery, Penny tripped over some rocks, and we cleared the rocks, and it was the foundation of the well that once stood there. And my dad knew in which direction to point, to look, and he counted 25 paces, and there, again, he found the grave, with trees around that weren't there before, and he fell upon it. And since then, I've been back to Poland 5 times, pay respect to my grandfather's grave. You know, the cemetery in Częstochowa, one of the last people to be buried there was Donna's mother, because they lived in Poland, they stayed in Poland. And when she died, her father and her kid brother came to the United States. But Tamara was one of the first people, Tamara Jesinovich, one of the last people to be buried there. My wife's mother, my mother-in-law, thank God, is still with us, the only one of our parents that is still alive. She's not just turned 96 years old last month, and here she is with one of her 8 great-grandchildren. 2 of them are here. The Torahs, finding hidden Holocaust Torahs. This is what they look like when we found them. I'll show you more pictures of them. See, in 1988, Jack Abramowitz, went to Poland with his father, I think an uncle, and he came across someone, one of the few Jews, 3 or 4 Jews were still living in town, intermarried most of them, and said, let me show you what we have in our old mikveh building, a factory now. And Jack went there, and he couldn't believe what he saw. And he came back, and he told me what he found. Torah scrolls, Talmudic works, Sidurim, Masarim, holy books, and he didn't know what to do with it. I mean, it was there. He didn't come prepared for anything, and he brought back this Megillah and the story of what was found there. And that was in May of 1988. And I had plans to go to St. Martin for my summer vacation. Immediately canceled the plans. And Donna and Jack and Penny and I, we went to Poland. We went to Poland to see what was there. We had a couple of these Lucas bags. And we went there and we wanted to see what we could find. And we found a lot. But we again, weren't prepared for everything that was there. And we found, here's 5 of the 7 scrolls that we rescued. 2 of them are in our ark. One of them is in our lobby. Howie, stand up for a minute, Howie, because Howie was the first one to be bar mitzvahed with one of our restored Torahs. That's Howie in the middle, right there, pre-bar mitzvah. Since then, all our grandkids are bar mitzvah age, and I have photographs of it, were bat mitzvahed with the Holocaust Torahs. See, here it is, look at this. May 1st, 1989, and when we had a dedication of the 2 Torahs, not the 2 Torahs in the ark. This one's in the ark, this one is in our lobby. The second Torah in the ark hadn't arrived here yet. And here is the announcement of May 1989 that we're having a Holocaust memorial and a dedication of these 2 Torahs in this shul. The same table that you see standing right there before us, with the same candles, 6 candles being lit tonight. One of my most meaningful Torahs, besides what we have in the ark, and 15 have been restored since. But one of the most meaningful is this Torah was dedicated to a bungalow of Holocaust survivors in the Catskills in the mid-90s. In the summertime, when the Catskills was in operation, it was in the ark in their canteen that they used to daven in. And in the winter, it was Forest Hills Jewish Center, where one of the survivors took it. Jack and I, Donna and Penny, we paid for the restoration of 3 Torahs. This one in the bungalow colony, and also the 2 in the ark. Now, the 2 in the ark, one of them was dedicated here that day that we saw in May of 1989, and the second one went to the shul where I grew up in Fairlawn, New Jersey. When that shul in the 90s, like some shuls have to merge with other shuls, and when that shul was closed, I brought that second Torah here, and that's the 2 Torahs now, the first Torah and the second Torah that we have in our holy ark. But there were more things to take out. So in 1989, I went back to Poland, and I rescued 31 more Torahs, 31 more scrolls. This is the mikveh building. The only pictures we found of the mikveh building from the summer 1989 trip. This is how we found them. This time we brought army duffel bags, or the kind of duffel bags that the kids take to camp with them, and we took as many as we could out of Poland. And here I am with another fellow who went with me on a second trip, and we're showing off. These are the Torah scrolls we had in our bags. How do we get them out? Well, even the first time and then the second time, it was illegal to take them out of Poland. They called it their archives. They were rotting in the attic of a mikveh building, but it was illegal to take them out. It was legal to bring them into the United States, but it was against their laws. They're their archives, they claimed. But I didn't care. We didn't care. We took them out. And you see, we had to sneak into the building at night, I guess like spies, but we had to sneak in with flashlights, and covered flashlights when we weren't using them or turned them off, and we took as many out as we could. This is what Torahs look like. See, to take the 31 out, there happened to be in Warsaw, there had to be a Jewish museum. And we went to the Jewish museum as part of our trip when I stayed at the hotel, when we showed that previous picture at the hotel. And we took posters from the Jewish museum. We took the Eitz Chaim, the wooden rollers out, and we rolled them as tight as we possibly could, over and over to get them real tight, and we wrapped them in these posters. And the airport in Poland at the time, just like the old Idlewild Airport, if you remember, you could be on top looking down, see the people coming in on the belts. Well, the Polish airport in Warsaw was the same way. And we spent a day looking in 1989. It was 31 tourists. We spent the day looking, and we saw the belts. You had to declare things going out of the country. And we practiced. You can pick up something heavy and make it look like it's light. So we practiced, and we went on the line that you don't declare. And we got through. The first time when we had the 7, we didn't know what to do. We split up. Some people went to Czechoslovakia. Penny and I on 2 different airlines. We went to Frankfurt. She was stuck with most of the Torahs in her bag on that 7. Not intentionally, but that's the way it worked out. And we met in Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt we came back to the United States. Here is a Torah that's in the United States Air Force Academy, where I was stationed many, many years ago. This is the one in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, that now resides in our ark. Here's one in Denver, Colorado, an Orthodox congregation. By the way, they're in Orthodox, conservative, and Reform congregations have the Torahs. The ones that couldn't be restored are in lobbies and museums and lobbies of synagogues, like the one we have here. Temple Beth Torah lobby, we recognize it, that's it there. Here is the dedication here. In this show, you see Rabbi Cass and you see Cantor Fliegelman, and you see the 2 Torahs that are currently in our ark, the one from Fair Lawn and the one from TBT. And here, the only pictures I could get, there's more of our children, grandchildren that were, and Howie, who was who's a grandchild, but the others are great-grandchildren, carrying the Torahs. Evan, Ariana, my 4 grandchildren, Madeline, Rachel, Melanie, and Jenna, carrying our Torahs. Thank you for listening to my story, everybody.
Once asked a survivor who was in her final months of life if she had any one message for this generation of Jews. One message, what would you say to this generation? She said, it's almost impossible to tell the story of what happened. It's too hard. It's almost too hard. And for that reason, you must. And for that reason, you must. I'm so grateful that Harry has shared this story with us tonight. I'm grateful to the Rappaport and the Abramowitz families for sharing their family history with our TBT family and helping us to appreciate this dark chapter in our history, helping us to honor the memories of the 6 million, helping us to say each and every time we take these Torahs from our ark and chant from them, which we do on our holidays, that we'll never forget, and that Am Yisrael Chai, that the people of Israel continue to live. So we're going to take moments now, though it's hard to find words. And when you see the images like what Harry showed us, the images leave us speechless. They really do. And our hearts are heavy. But we're going to find words tonight, words of prayer as we begin our memorial service now. and the words which Jews have turned to for thousands of years that offer us some small measure of strength and comfort in a difficult time. And so I'll ask our cantor to join me now, and we'll begin with the words of the 23rd Psalm. We'll take moments for prayer, the lighting of our memorial candles. We'll take the 2 Holocaust Torahs out and give everyone an opportunity to see them and to express your love for our people by giving them a kiss if you'd like. And the Kaddish at the end will conclude the night. First, the words of the 23rd Psalm, words of strength, words of comfort.
Adonai roi lo echsar bin hot deshe yarbitzeni al mei menuchot yenaleni nafshi shovev yeshovev yancheni v'magale tzedek yancheni v'magle tzedek leman shemo gam ki elech bagay tzal mavet lo yirara ki ata imadi shiftecha umishantecha emayinachamuni ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged zorai dishanta vashemen roshi osirevaya Achtav chesed yirfuni kol yemei chayai kol yemei chayai v'shavti bevet Adonai le'orech yamim.
We've come here tonight to remember those who cannot be forgotten. We've come to speak of that which cannot be spoken, but simply must not be left unsaid. We've come to remind ourselves of what was done and what was not done. We've come to ask questions that simply cannot be answered, but cannot be left unasked. We know how to remember the dead we have known. We know how to commemorate the death of one. But all of us tonight are mourners. All of us recall not one, but 6 million ones. Not alone those we have known, but those no one can know. The names that are forever lost, but forever in our hearts. Esa Einai, we lift our eyes unto the heavens. We ask God for help.
Esa Einai el harim, me'ayin yavo Ezri me'im Adonai עשה שמים וארץ, אל ייתן למות רגלך, אל ינום שומרך, הנה לא ינום ולא ישי, שומר ישראל. אדוני שומרך, אדוני צילך על יד ימינך, יומם השמש לא יכך, וירח בלילה. אדוני ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, אדוני ישמורך ובואך מעתה ועד עולם.
Come now to the lighting of our memorial candles. Rodi, would you like to help? 6 million lives that cut short. 6 million who still had a song left to sing in this world. I'll ask everyone to rise now for the memorial prayer as we remember and ask God to watch over the souls of 6 million.
El male rachamim shochen b'meramim, amsei menucha nechona תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנפתחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם, אנא בעל הרחמים, הסירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Passionate God, grant infinite rest in your presence among the holy and the pure, to the souls of all of our brothers and sisters who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes. May their memories endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our own lives. May their souls be bound up in the bond of life and in our hearts forever. May they rest in peace. Amen. Going to ask everyone now to join me in moments of silence as Madeline Propus and Ariana Palmer come here to the bima. They're going to be carrying the 2 Holocaust Sifrei Torah that we learned about tonight. And as we come around the sanctuary, we'll have an opportunity to see them, to be grateful for them. And I hope we'll just take these moments as moments for private and silent reflection while that happens. So now that we've had a moment of silent respect, we're going to sing the song that we sing every single Shabbat when our Sifrei Torah come out as an expression of our celebration and love for continued Jewish life here at TBT. It goes like this. Torah, 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 Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, Torah. So if everyone can come back together now, we're going to conclude for the evening with one final prayer. Okay, folks. We gave out at the start of the evening a sheet that has a special Kaddish. We know the Kaddish is said when we remember loved ones, but it's a prayer of exalting, of lifting up. A big Yesher Koach to the family members who are here and helping. Thank you, guys. And this special Kaddish that helps us to feel close to the memories of those whose lives were stolen during the Shoah includes interwoven into the words of the prayer the names of those horrific camps that we learned about tonight. We speak those evil names, but really the Kaddish is about not the names of the camps. It's about the names of those we remember, the nameless and those, like those who we spoke about tonight, who were beloved family members, those who still had life left to live. So I'll begin in the Hebrew, and when I pause, Cantor and everyone who can, please join me in saying the words of this special Kaddish for tonight as we remember and never forget. Yitzgadal
Auschwitz,
Vayitzgadash
Lodz,
Shemei Rabbah
Bonar,
Be'alma Divra Kirutei
Babi Yar,
V'yamlich Malchutei
Maidanek,
V'chayechon Uv'yomechon
Birkna,
Uv'chaye D'chol Beit Yisrael
Kovna,
Bagalav Izman Kariv
Novska,
V'imru Amen
Amen.
Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevarach Le'olam U'lamei Amaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach,
Reisenstadt,
v'yitpoar v'yitromam,
Buchenwald,
v'yitnaseh v'yitadar,
Blinke,
v'yitaleh v'yitalal,
Vilna,
Shemei dekutsha barichu,
Bergen-Belsen,
Leila,
Mauthausen,
min kol birchata v'shirata,
Dachau,
tushbechata v'nechamata,
Minsk,
damiran me'alma,
Warsaw,
v'imru amen.
Main,
Yehei shlom rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, v'yaseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru
Amen.
amen. May the God who makes peace in the heavens grant strength to us and peace to this world that is in such desperate need of it. Thank you again to Harry for sharing your powerful, powerful presentation tonight. To the Rappaport and to the Abramowitz families, you're a blessing to us, and we thank you. To everyone who came and joined us tonight, thank you for taking some time out of your busy day and busy schedules to know that we have a mitzvah, a sacred commandment to remember and to never forget. Thanks, everybody.